The wealthy rancher demanded an untouched bride. Then she revealed the secret she carried. The contract was on the table between us when she told me. I remember the lamp was smoking a little. The wick needed trimming and I hadn't gotten around to it. And outside the wind was doing what it does in October out here, coming down off the ridge in long cold pulls that found the gaps in the walls I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. The house was big. I'd built it big on purpose. 12 rooms, pine floors, a kitchen with a cast iron range that could heat half the ground floor. I'd built it to tell the territory something about me. That's the honest truth of it, even if I didn't know it then. Her name was Clara Voss. She'd come off the stage that afternoon from Denver by way of Salida, and I'd had Hector drive the buckboard to meet her because I didn't see any reason to go myself. She was a mail-order arrangement drawn up through a correspondence broker and 3 letters exchanged over 2 months. Her letters were short. Mine were shorter. I listed what I owned. She listed what she could do: cook, sew, keep accounts, tend a kitchen garden. Neither one of us mentioned anything warmer than that, and I thought that was the right way to go about it. When Hector brought her to the door, I was still at my desk. I heard the wheels on the gravel, heard him say something in Spanish he probably thought I couldn't catch. He'd said it was a long ride and she hadn't complained once, and then she knocked. I called her in. She was not what I expected. I don't mean her looks, though she was handsome in a way that caught me off guard, dark-haired and steady-eyed. I mean her posture. She stood in the doorway of my house like she was deciding whether to come further in, and she took a moment to decide. That was the first thing I noticed, that she wasn't in a hurry to please me. I stood and gestured to the chair across the desk, and she sat down and set a small traveling bag on the floor beside her feet and folded her hands in her lap. I said something about the journey. She said it was long. I said something about the weather. She said she'd seen worse. And then I pushed the contract across the table, 2 pages I'd had drawn up by my solicitor in town, the terms of the arrangement, what she'd have, what I expected, and she didn't reach for it right away. She looked at it, then she looked at me. She said, "I need to tell you something first." I thought she meant a condition she'd forgotten to put in her letters, some preference about the room or a question about the arrangement. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Go ahead." She said, "I am not untouched. I have a child, a boy. He is 4 years old and he is with my sister in Denver until I send for him." The lamp threw its yellow light across the desk. The wind found a gap somewhere near the chimney and made a sound like breath. I sat there and I didn't say anything for a while, and she sat across from me with her hands still folded and her eyes steady on my face, waiting to see what I was made of. Now I should tell you something about the contract. The second page, halfway down, had a clause. It had been my solicitor's suggestion, and I'd let it stand because I hadn't thought hard enough about why it bothered me. The clause said, in plain language, that the woman entering the arrangement would be unmarried and without prior encumbrances. That was the word, encumbrances. Like a child was a fence post in a field. I'd let it stand, and now here was this woman watching me remember that I had. The honest answer, if you'd asked me at that moment what I felt, was not what I would have told you then. Then I would have said I felt the arrangement had been misrepresented. That would have been the business version, the one I put between myself and anything that required me to examine it. The truth was something else. The truth was a cold settling in my chest, and it had nothing to do with the boy. I had put a clause in a contract about a woman's purity, and she had come here knowing it was there, knowing she didn't meet it, and she had come anyway, and she was sitting across from me with her hands folded and her eyes level, because she had decided that honesty was the only currency she had, and she was going to spend it, even if it cost her the arrangement, even if it cost her the house and the security and whatever small future she'd been trying to build. That was the moment right there before I'd said a word that something shifted in me. I didn't know it fully then. It came clear later, but looking at her sitting still in that chair, waiting for me to decide her fate off a clause in a legal document, I felt something I can only describe now as shame. Not the hot kind. The cold, sitting kind. The kind that's been there a long time and you've only just walked into the room where it lives. I said, "How old did you say he was?" She said, "4, his name is Willem." I said, "What happened to his father?" She said, "He went back to Ohio and married a woman his mother approved of." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. I folded the contract and put it in the desk drawer. I didn't tear it up. I want to be truthful about that. I didn't have any kind of dramatic gesture in me that night. I just put it away because I didn't want it on the table between us anymore. Then I told her that Hector's wife Rosa would show her to the East Room and that supper would be in an hour if she wanted it, and that she should get some rest. She looked at the desk drawer where I'd put the contract. She looked at me. She said thank you in a way that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite suspicion, and was mostly just wariness, and she picked up her traveling bag and went. I sat at the desk for a long time after that. I should tell you what I'd been before this house, before this land, because it matters to understanding what I was sitting with that night. I came to this territory at 23 with 2 horses, a surveyor's compass, and a gift for reading land that I'd gotten from my father and his father before him, knowing which ground would drain and which would hold, which grass went deep and which was just surface, where the water ran underground in a dry year. I started small, leased grazing land from a man named Aldicott who thought I'd fail and wanted to watch it happen, and I didn't fail. I bought out my first parcel at 27. I acquired the Sutter place when old Hank Sutter had a bad winter and needed to sell quick. I built careful and I expanded patient, and by the time I was 42, I owned more of this valley than anyone else in it, and I had a house with 12 rooms and a cast-iron range and pine floors I'd paid a man from Missouri to lay, and I was alone in it. That's the part that's hard to say straight. I was alone in it. I'd had a wife early. Her name was Margaret. She died of fever 7 years after we married, and we never did have children, and when she went she took something I hadn't known I'd been counting on, some expectation that the rest of it would have a point, and I went hard after that. Harder than I'd been. I worked the land and I bought more land and I built the house bigger, and I told myself that was the thing to do because the land was real and permanent, and everything else was not. And then one morning I woke up in that 12-room house, and it was very quiet and I was 51 years old. That's when I wrote to the correspondence broker. Not out of loneliness, I would have told you, out of practicality. I needed someone to manage the household accounts, someone to sit across from at supper. I was practical about it. I drew up terms. I signed the contract with my name and date. Practical, that's the word I used instead of the one that was true. Rosa had left a plate for me in the kitchen, and I ate it standing at the counter, which is something I did when I couldn't settle to sitting, old habit from long days on the range, when eating was just a thing you did between other things. Beans and salt pork and a wedge of cornbread. I ate it and looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard and thought about a 4-year-old boy named Willem who was somewhere in Denver, and what it said about his mother that she hadn't tried to hide him. She could have waited, could have come here, gotten herself established, written to her sister in a month or 2 with some explanation smoothed out in advance. Could have managed it. Instead, she'd sat down across from me before she'd taken off her coat and told me flat. The only currency she had. I don't know why that kept sitting with me. Maybe because I'd built this whole life on a version of the same thing. You give what you have. You don't pretend to more, and you don't flinch when someone looks at the sum of it. I'd done it with land and cattle and labor. She'd done it with the only thing she had on that table, which was the truth about herself, and it had cost her just as much to put it there. I went to bed late. I slept badly. The wind had picked up and was working at something on the roof, a loose shingle over the back bedroom. I'd been meaning to see to it, and in between the gusts there was that particular silence a big house has at night, the kind that's different from the silence of a small house, heavier and more present, like the space itself knows it's empty. She was up before Rosa. I came down at first light and she was already in the kitchen. She'd found the coffee, found the pot, figured out the range without being shown, and there was a cup waiting on the counter. She was standing at the window with her own cup, looking out at the morning. She didn't startle when I came in. She just glanced at me over her shoulder and said, "The mountain has snow on it now." I said, "Came in overnight." She said, "Do you lose cattle to it?" I said, "Some years. We move them down before it gets serious." She nodded and turned back to the window, and I drank my coffee standing at the counter, both of us quiet, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet. That surprised me. I had expected something harder, a stiffness to the morning, but she moved in the kitchen like she was comfortable in kitchens, like she was just in a new one. I said, "I'm in to say about last night." She turned around. I said, "I had a clause in that contract that had no business being in it." She looked at me steadily. I said, "I should have torn it up last night and I didn't, but I want to say now that it doesn't stand. It never should have." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's an honest thing saying that before you need to." I didn't know what to do with that. I put my cup down and said I had a south fence to ride and I'd be back for the noon meal. The south fence was fine. The south fence is almost always fine. But I rode it anyway because I needed the cold air and the horse under me, and something that required only the part of my mind that looks at fence posts and checks the wire. What I kept thinking about was the word she'd used, honest, like it was something notable, like she'd learned to measure it against its absence. She'd done that, the thing she'd done last night, coming in here knowing the clause was in the contract, and telling me anyway. She'd done that because she decided the arrangement wasn't worth having if it was built on a hidden thing. She could have kept Willem quiet for a while and built herself into the situation, and made herself harder to dislodge, and then produced the boy as a settled fact. I knew women who'd made calculations like that. I'd made some of my own, in business, and I wasn't proud of the ones that had worked by concealment. She hadn't done it that way. There are men who would have handed her the contract and pointed to the clause and told her to get back on the stage. I'd known men like that too. I'd been partway toward being one last night, that first cold moment when she'd said it and I'd sat there calculating. And what I kept circling back to, riding that south fence in the October cold, was that if I'd done that, if I'd sent her away, it wouldn't have been about the clause at all. It would have been about the fact that she'd walked in here with less to offer than I'd specified on paper, and she hadn't flinched. And that had made me feel something I hadn't been comfortable with, which was that maybe the thing I'd specified on paper said more about my fear than about what I actually needed. I needed a woman with a spine. I needed a woman who'd walk into a stranger's house and put the hard thing on the table, because she'd decided honesty was the only foundation worth building on. I'd had that. I'd had it with Margaret, who told me inside the first week of our marriage that I worked like I was running from something and asked me what it was. Nobody had said anything like that to me before or since, and when she died I'd gone back to the version of myself that didn't have to answer that kind of question. Bigger land, bigger house, quieter rooms. I turned the horse around at the south corner and headed back. She was in the kitchen garden when I came in at noon, just walking it, looking at what was left after the first frosts, the parsnips still in the ground, a few late cabbages, the dead canes of what had been the bean rows. Rosa was watching her from the porch with an expression I recognized as grudging approval, which from Rosa was significant. I unsaddled and brushed the horse and left him with fresh water and went in through the back. Clara came in a few minutes later, took off her coat, and started helping Rosa with the noon meal like it had been arranged. We sat at the table, me, Clara, Hector, Rosa. We ate. Hector talked about a heifer he was worried about. Rosa said the parsnips would need to come up before the next hard freeze. Clara asked Hector what the signs were when a heifer was about to have trouble, and Hector explained, and she listened with her head slightly tilted in a way that meant she was actually putting it away, not just being polite. After the meal, Hector and Rosa went back out, and I poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her and sat down. She said, "You've decided something." I said, "I have." She waited. I said, "The arrangement, if you still want it, on different terms than the contract. No clause like that. The boy comes when you're ready to send for him." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was even. She said, "I want to understand what you're getting out of it." I said, "I don't follow." She said, "You put that clause in because you wanted something specific. I don't meet that. I want to understand why you're still sitting here." And here's where I had to choose the business answer, which was about practicality and accounts, and someone to sit across from at supper, or the real one. I sat with it for a moment. I said, "Last night when you told me about your boy, the way you did it, straight at me before you'd taken your coat off, knowing full well what was in that contract, I thought, that's how I'd want a partner to be. That's the thing I'd want beside me, not the condition I'd written in. The actual quality that makes a life work." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "My boy is not a problem to be managed." I said, "I know that." She said, "If he comes, he's mine and he's here and I won't have him kept out of sight." I said, "I wouldn't expect otherwise." She looked at her coffee cup. She turned it once in her hands. Then she said, "All right." We didn't shake hands. We didn't have a dramatic moment. She got up and rinsed her cup and went back to whatever she'd been doing, and I sat at that table for a while listening to the house around me. It felt different. Can't say exactly why. Same walls, same floors, same wind working at that shingle over the back bedroom. But the quality of the quiet had changed. There was the sound of someone moving in the next room. That was all it was. The sound of someone moving in the next room. Willem came 6 weeks later on the eastbound stage. I drove the buckboard myself. He was a small, serious boy with his mother's dark eyes and her habit of looking at a thing carefully before deciding what to do about it. He had a canvas bag that contained, as far as I could tell, a piece of quartz he'd found somewhere, a folded paper drawing that he wouldn't show me, and a wooden horse missing one of its hind legs, which didn't seem to bother him. He sat on the bench seat between Clara and me with his hands on his knees and watched the road with considerable attention. About halfway back to the ranch, he asked me, "Do you have horses?" I said, "Several." He said, "Real ones?" I said, "Last I checked." He seemed to find this adequate. He went back to watching the road. Clara didn't say anything, but out of the corner of my eye I could see the set of her shoulders drop about an inch, like something she'd been holding loosened a little. That winter was a hard one. We lost 17 head in the January blow, which was fewer than some of the outfits north of us lost, but it was still 17 head and 3 weeks of work in the cold getting the rest of them down. Hector and I and 2 of the younger hands were out more nights than not, and there were 3 days in a row where the temperature didn't get above 10, and the wind was sideways and constant. I came in from those nights frozen to the collar, hands cracked, a bone tiredness that went deeper than the muscles. Clara was always up. I didn't ask her to be, I didn't expect it. But she was up, and there was heat from the range and something hot to eat or drink, and she'd take my coat and gloves without fuss and hang them and say something plain about whether the herd was holding. No theatrics, no excessive worrying at me, just present and warm and competent and there. One night, the worst of them, the 3rd night of the January blow, I came in around 2 in the morning, and I was shaking, and not entirely from cold. We'd had to put down a 2-year-old bull I'd been fond of, got him out of a drift too late, and there's something about putting down an animal you've worked alongside that doesn't get easier with practice. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I just sat there. She put a mug down in front of me. She stood beside me for a moment. Then she put her hand on the back of my neck. Not a word, just that. Her hand, warm and certain, on the back of my neck. I don't know how long I sat there. A while. She didn't move her hand right away. And sitting there in my own kitchen in the dead middle of that frozen night with her hand on my neck, I thought, this is what I built this place for. Not the 12 rooms, not the pine floors, not any of the large and permanent things. This something warm and sure in the dark, a person who stays. I said eventually, thank you. She said, you're cold, drink the coffee. I drank the coffee. Spring came the way it does out here, not all at once but in arguments, warm days followed by hard frosts, mud and then freeze and then mud again, the creek running high and brown with snowmelt. Willem had discovered the horses in winter, and by spring he was a fixture in the barn, dragging a bucket he couldn't quite carry and watching Hector with an intensity that Hector found both flattering and slightly alarming. Hector had started teaching him the names of the horses and some other things in Spanish, which meant that at supper, Willem would sometimes make an announcement in mixed Spanish and English that neither Clara nor I could fully parse, but the intention was always clear. The boy was, as it turned out, not a problem to be managed. He was a person with his own weight and particularity. He hoarded his piece of quartz. He had opinions about which biscuits were the best ones that he was willing to defend at length. He had a habit of appearing silently at my elbow when I was at the desk, which startled me every time, and then waiting with great patience until I noticed him, and then asking one very specific question about whatever I was working on. He was 4 and then 5, and then the questions got more specific. I taught him how to check the wire on a fence. I taught him how to read the color of the morning sky. I taught him that a horse that's twitchy at the cinch usually has a reason. One afternoon in that second spring, he was 5 by then, he was watching me oil a saddle and he asked, "Are you my father?" I put the rag down. I said, "I'm not the man who made you, but I'm the man who's here." He thought about this with the characteristic Voss thoroughness. He said, "Okay." He picked up a rag and started copying what I'd been doing with the leather oil. I watched his small hands working at it. He did it wrong, which is the right way to start. I haven't told this in order, I know that. That's the trouble with a long stretch of life. It doesn't arrange itself neatly. The winter and the boy and the south fence all blur at the edges, and what I remember most clearly are the specific things. The wick that needed trimming the night she came. The weight of her words across that desk. The way she turned the coffee cup in her hands before she said all right. I want to tell you about one more thing, though. One evening in that second autumn, the good one, the one where the grass had come in strong and we'd had enough rain and the herd was fat and the accounts were the best they'd been in 3 years. Willem was asleep. Hector and Rosa had gone to their place. The house was quiet in the way it's quiet now, which is different from the way it was quiet before, occupied quiet, resting quiet, not empty quiet. We were sitting on the porch. The light was going off the ridge in long horizontal bars, and the whole valley was going gold and then copper, and the air was that particular cool, dry October smell of cut grass and dust, and something just beginning to frost. I had a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. She had a shawl around her shoulders and was watching the light change. She said after a while, "You know what I thought when I first saw this valley?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "I thought whoever built here knew what they were doing, picked the right ground, the right angle to the weather, thought ahead." I said, "My father taught me to read land." She said, "He taught you well." I didn't say anything. She said, "I wasn't sure about you, you know, that first night." I said, "I wasn't sure about me either." She smiled. I could see it in profile, the corners of her mouth, her eyes staying on the ridge. She reached over without looking and put her hand over mine, the one holding the cold coffee cup, and just let it rest there. There's a thing that happens when you've been alone a long time and then you're not. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just a hand over yours in the last light, on a porch you built on ground you chose, and you realize the house isn't too big anymore. It's the right size. It just needed filling. I didn't say any of that. I sat there with her hand on mine and looked at the valley going dark and thought that I had spent 20 years building something I'd never been able to name, and now I could name it, and it was right here. 53 years old, a 12-room house with pine floors, a boy who asked good questions, a woman who'd walked in with nothing but the truth and turned out to be the most permanent thing I'd ever acquired. The last light went off the ridge. The first stars came out over the eastern dark. Neither of us moved. I wasn't in any hurry. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't in any hurry at all.